Welcome in this follow-up video regarding the North Korean cinema. If you are watching this video, I'm assuming that you have watched the main video, which was an overview of the North Korean film industry history and some recommendation of their best film, in my opinion, of course. First, I want to thank you for having watched this video because I know the subject is a bit specific, is a bit not really sexy subject. So I really applaud your curiosity, and I'm grateful that you took the time to check it out. And I hope you found it interesting, and you will check some of the films that I recommended. And if you are interested about North Korean cinema, I really recommend you to check the channel North Korean Movie Reviews, which, as its title says, does review of North Korean films. It's a very good channel, very interesting, very informative, with movie reviews, but also some general discussion about some specific topics related to North Korea, and it's really well done. So I really strongly recommend for you to at least have a look on the channel and see and check a bit what he has done there. I'm sure you will find some to your liking, and you will learn new things by checking some of his video. In my case, as was expected, given the subject, I didn't have much comments, so there was only basically one from Nekoala regarding the golden age of North Korean cinema, the 80s, and he asked me to develop a bit more about this golden age of North Korean cinema. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So in order to understand why the 80s were the golden age of North Korean cinema, we need to develop a little bit more than what I did in my previous video, because in my previous video I gave a general overview of the North Korean film industry, and of course it's very general and it doesn't go into detail. So in this video I will have to go a bit more into details about how it happened that the 80s became the golden age of North Korean cinema. And you have to realize that during the 50s and the 60s, North Korea was actually more economically developed than its counterpart in the South. I know it may sound crazy because we are so used that South Korea is way ahead compared to North Korea, but there was a time, 20 years roughly, during which North Korea was more developed than South Korea. It's not just because North Korean regime was better than the South Korean one. There was some other factors, one of them being that the Japanese actually during the colonization had developed considerably the industrial infrastructure of Korea, and that was mostly in the north, not in the south. And so the North Korean benefited from that, and they also benefited from a strong help from the Warsaw Pact countries during the rebuilding process, especially from East Germany. And the fact is also that because of the mass organization system they had in North Korea, they were able to mobilize the population and to achieve some good results, to achieve some progress, some early progress quite fast during the first years after the end of the Korean War. So all these reasons explain why for a time North Korea was indeed more prosperous than South Korea. But this situation changed during the end of the 60s, early 70s, and of course, as we know now, it would never change. The South Korea would become much more prosperous than the North. And the leaders in North Korea were aware that the economy was decreasing. They were aware that their image also was decreasing. And this decrease of productivity in the economy also came at the same time as they developed the Juche ideology, which is a very very vague ideology, but which main mantra is self-reliance, which is a mantra which is often used by many nationalist countries. But usually it doesn't lead to really good economic results, and that was the case for North Korea. And so during that time, Juche was developed, and that's also during that time that Kim Jong-il won the succession war. Kim Jong-il was not necessarily supposed to become the successor of his father. No, it seems like it was always supposed to be like this, but no, during a couple of years there were actually some other contestants, and at the end it's Kim Jong-il who took over. So he took over during the 70s and became officially the ruler of North Korea in 1980, if I'm correct. And so, as you know, Kim Jong-il was very interested in cinema, and is rather a cinephile himself, even if it seems like he has a taste mostly for Hollywood blockbusters. But anyway, he was completely aware of the deficiencies of North Korea economically, and also when it comes to the film industry, and so he was very motivated in order to reverse that and to improve the North Korean film industry, even if it meant going against some of the instructions he had set in his own book, which personally I'm quite sure he hasn't really written it himself, but anyway, that's another story. He was perfectly aware that he could not continue by just putting super propaganda film, and he had to try to change a bit the way North Korean films were done in order to make them more attractive, and more attractive locally in North Korea, but also internationally. Because at the same time that South Korea was developing considerably economically speaking, they were also increasing their image, their attractivity worldwide. And that culminated in 1988 with the Olympic Games, which took place in Seoul. And North Korea was very aware of that and really tried very hard in order to compete with South Korea in order to get more international recognition. They tried to be a co-host of the Olympic Games that failed, and they threatened South Korea regarding the organization of the games. And so improving their cinema was part of this general policy in order for the country to become more attractive for worldwide audiences. And this modernization was had for main mastermind Shing Sang-Ok. So when it comes to Shing Sang-Ok, I think it's fair to give the two different explanations which exist regarding his work in North Korea. The main theory, which is the one I have kept in my video, is that he was kidnapped and he had to work for North Korea for several years until he was able to escape in 1986. That's his version of the events, and that's the one which is usually followed by most of the people and most of the scholars on the subject. But to be fair, you have to be aware that there is a counter theory which says that Shing Sang-Ok actually came to North Korea from his own will, because he had a certain amount of difficulties in the south. That's the theory which is defended by North Korea itself, but it has also Tetsuo Nishida, a friend of Shing Sang-Ok, who defend this theory. So it's a minority. It's a minority of people who defend this theory. To be fair, once again, we have to admit that sometimes there were indeed some famous artists or sports personality or politician who went from their own will to the north. That happened. That was not completely new. So it's not an impossible scenario. It could have happened. Having said that, I personally think that the kidnapping theory remains the most credible one for two reasons. The first reason is that back then North Korea was indeed had indeed a very active policy of international kidnapping, so that was nothing really new for them during that time. The second point is that usually when people went to North Korea from their own will, they would be paraded during a press conference, during some propaganda newsreel, and they would be shown as a success of the regime, the proof that the North Korean regime is better than the South Korean regime. And that didn't happen with Shing Sang-Ok, who disappeared in 1978 and reappeared in North Korea in 1983. According to Shing Sang-Ok, this time period was spent in prison. He tried to escape, and then he was caught before he managed, and so he was kept in prison. He was tortured, and that lasted for several years until he finally converted to the North Korean ideology, at least pretending to be, in order to be able to live normally and have a further opportunity of escape in the future. And indeed, I mean, if he had come from his own will, it would be very surprising that the North Korean authority would not have publicized his presence there for 5 years. That makes no sense. That's really not the way they do. But the truth is, we will probably never know the full picture of these events until the North Korean regime crumbled and we have access to their archives. But I think you have to be aware of these two versions of the events. Anyway, so Shing Sang-Ok in 83, 84 finally started working in the cinema, in the North Korean cinema industry, and was given almost a green light. I mean, almost full power by Kim Jong-il in order to improve the industry, and it actually you can already feel it in the first film he directed in North Korea in 1984, which is An Emissary of No Return, which unfortunately I haven't seen. It was a film much different from usual North Korean practice, from the simple fact that it was partly shot in Europe, which was really something never made before him in North Korea. The story is dealing with the Hague Conference, which took place in 1907, during which the Korean tried to get the international community attention against the colonization of Japan. So a quite interesting subject. As I haven't seen the film, I cannot say if it's good, but it's certainly worth a look if you are interested in North Korean cinema or Korean history in general. Then he did Love, Love, My Love the same year. And Love, Love, My Love is actually a retelling of the famous Chunyong Tale. Chunyong Tale is an old pansori story which is extremely famous in Korea, and I say Korea as a whole, North and South. And it had been adapted many times, either in the North, either in the South. And so Shing Sang-Ok did another version of the film in 84. But what is interesting in his version, which once again, unfortunately, I haven't seen yet, but the main point of interest is that there is a much more important presence of love, and I mean love between a male and a female, which seems a given for a story like this. Chunyong is basically the Korean Romeo and Juliet. So it has to be love, but But the truth is that when they did that in North Korea earlier, they were dealing more with the filial piety aspect of the story and less about love. And that's consistent with the way North Korean cinema for a long time before Shing Sang-Ok dealt with love, for the simple reason that love had to be for the country, love had to be for the leader, and so there was not much love between men and women being shown in North Korean film for a long time. And Love, Love, My Love is one of the films which started to open the door for more of this kind of love being shown on the silver screen. Having said that, for people like us, I'm pretty sure that this aspect must be still very modest. But anyway, you have to put that into the context, the specific context of North Korean cinema. And one interesting aspect of the time that Shing Sang-Ok was in charge, and the couple of years after he left, was the fact that North Korea engaged in many co-production. As I explained in the main video, co-production actually are a good thing for North Korean cinema. That usually helps make them better. So I mentioned Meet in Pyongyang, which in my opinion is indeed the best co-production and probably the best North Korean film. But there were some others being made during that time, and some fairly interesting ones. One of them in 1988 was Missione Finale, or Ultimate Mission, directed by Ferdinando Baldi. So a North Korean Italian co-production, an action film being shot in North Korea, and having for lead Frank Zagarino. You may not be aware who is Frank Zagarino, but he was kind of a famous name in the direct-to-video circle during the 80s and 90s. A muscled American blonde guy, a poor man's version of Schwarzenegger, basically. And so he found himself in this Italian North Korean co-production shot in North Korea. The film itself is not very good, but you see sometimes some of the Pyongyang locations or some other locations throughout North Korea. So it's a curiosity. It's not really a good film, but it's quite a curiosity to see an Italian action film taking place in North Korea, even if it's never said clearly that it happens in North Korea. If you have the possibility, I suggest you check the book about North Korean cinema that I listed in the description of the main video, which has an interview with Ferdinando Baldi, talking about the production on the shooting of the film, and it's quite interesting. It has some interesting stories about how the film was made. It's probably one of those films where the making is much more interesting than the result itself. There was also a co-production with Japan in 1985 called A Silver Hairpin, which unfortunately I haven't seen. So why a co-production between North Korea and Japan? So if you don't know about it, Japan has a minority of Koreans living there, basically stranded since the end of the Second World War, and who don't have the Japanese nationality but who have the residency in Japan. And they have been, of course, fragmented because of the separation of Korea between the North and the South. And that's the case also in Japan. You have one part of the minority which is aligned to the South, and one part which is aligned to the North, under the patronage of an association called the Chongryon, which is piloted by a North Korean regime. And so this co-production was between North Korea and the Changgyeon, the North Korean living in Japan. So not sure we can really call it a co-production. Technically it is a co-production, but in reality it's between two entities of North Korea. So not sure it's really it should really be considered as such. But anyway, a North Korean film shot in Japan because of that, so that makes it an interesting film to watch, I guess. But I cannot tell you if it's good or not. Given the track record of North Korean cinema, I would not be too confident about the quality of the film, but who knows. And during the same period, so during this golden age of North Korean cinema, there was also a couple of co-productions with the USSR. And one of them was Eternal Comrades, which was produced in 1985, and which was a retelling of the liberation of Korea by the Red Army and by Kim Il-sung. And that's an interesting subject because for a long time the propaganda of North Korea kind of put aside the importance of Russian Soviet intervention in the liberation of Korea in order to elevate the part of Kim Il-sung and to give him more legitimacy as the president of the country. And so doing a film on this subject is fairly surprising. It's probably linked to the fact that during that time the relationship between USSR and North Korea were improving. So that probably opened the door for this kind of collaboration. Also worth of note is the fact that we see Kim Il-sung in the film. And I'm saying that because in many North Korean films we rarely see Kim Il-sung appears. He appears in some early 1950s films dealing with the War of Liberation, as I said. But then after he kind of disappeared, and the way he's being used in North Korean cinema is very reminiscent, in my opinion, of the way Jesus Christ is used in Hollywood swords and sandal films. I'm thinking of films like Ben-Hur. So in Ben-Hur, you never see directly Jesus. You only see his feet. You only see him from afar giving a speech. You never have a clear view of him. And I find this approach being the one being used in North Korea for the most part. You often hear about the great leader. You often have people talking about how they met him or how they were saved in a way by his speech. Or sometimes you would see his car going away after he has done a visit, an on-site visit, these kind of things. But you never see him physically. It's like a presence, a godlike presence, basically. And so this film, that's not the case. You really see him played by another actor. And so that's a bit surprising. I don't know if the film was actually shown in North Korea. I'm really curious about this information, but I could not find it. Anyway, that was quite daring from a North Korean perspective to do a film on this subject. Having said that, Eternal Comrades is watchable, but it's nothing incredible. I mean, as it is often the case with North Korean films. And they did another co-production a bit later in 1990, so the very last co-production between the USSR and North Korea, and it's called The Shores of Rescue, a group of Russian revolutionaries who find themselves stranded on the Korean countryside and was to go back to Russia, and they are helped by the villagers, the Korean villagers, and they have to escape from the the evil Japanese colonialists who are trying to capture them. It's decent. It's actually not bad for North Korean film. Yeah, in a co-production configuration. It's a fairly entertaining, not too preachy. It's quite okay. I mean, if you want to explore a bit further some of these co-production, this one is not a bad choice. And I also want to add a little bit about martial art films in North Korea. So as you can see from the recommendation I did in Rimkok-jong, there are some martial arts fights sometimes, and that's also once again something I think which can be traced from Shing Sang-Ok. You would not necessarily have martial art being used in films before him, so that's one of the thing he brought to the North Korean film industry. And so you have some of it in Rimkok-jong, but you also have a film like Kil Dong, which is an adaptation once again of a famous legend, Korean legend, with some kind of Robin Hood. And Kil Dong, which was made in '86, if I'm correct, yeah, '86, is actually a fairly decent martial art film. I think it's at the top of the North Korean films. Of course, if you compare it to Hong Kong martial art films, it's just somewhere in the middle. I mean, it's not the level of a Lo Kar-leung, Sammo Hung film. I mean, it's way below that. But for North Korean standard, it's really the top of the top, and still a fairly decent film, martial art film. So if you want to see something a bit entertaining, a bit martial art style North Korean film, Kil Dong is probably the easiest choice, because Rimkok-jong, even if there are some elements, it's diluted in five films of more than 1 hour each, so you will have a bit more difficulty if you are looking for that to find them in Rimkok-jong compared to Kil Dong, which is just 90-minute straight martial arts film. There have been further attempts later on to do martial arts film. There have been in 2006 Pyongyang Nalpharam, but despite some good training sequences,
날파람 평양 날파람 택견아 택견아 우리 몫을 지켜가자 평양 날파람. 평양 날파람 택견아 택견아 우리 지상 뚫쳐가자 평양 날파람.
The film itself is fairly disappointing. They also tried to put martial arts sequence in Order Number 27, the Commando film, which was also made under the patronage of Shing Sang-Ok. But in those two films, the main problem is the direction and the editing. You can see that the practitioners, the actors, are good martial artists. There are certainly some Taekwondo champions, I have no doubt about that, and they are certainly really good, but each time they are betrayed by the editing and the way the angle are chosen. a lack of high standards when it comes to the final result. There are some takes which are used where you think they should have reshot it, but they probably didn't have enough film, I'm guessing, or stuff like that, so they had to go with a take which is obviously not very good. So there are a lot of problems with these films, and it's really unfortunate. They have some potential to do some good martial art film, but since Kil Dong, it has never really been successful. So that's it about more development on the golden age of North Korean cinema. I really suggest you to watch some of the North Korean films I have recommended. You don't have to be like me, you don't have to be masochistic and watch tens of them, because for the most part they are not very good, as I said in the main video, but I really think it's worth to at least have a look to a few, 4 or 5 of them, in order to have a better idea of what they are doing and have a better idea of what is North Korea to some extent. And that's the end for this video, for this follow-up video on this subject. I will see you in the next video, which will be published at the end of next week. See you very soon.